Dayne Brajkovich's life reads like a crime saga written on skin. Born in Perth's working-class suburb of Belmont in 1979, he started out as a boxer, but soon traded the ring for the outlaw world. An ecstasy conviction in 2009 hardened him, prison turning him into something bigger, stronger, angrier, and hungry for power. By the time he rose to Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels, his tattoos told the story: revenge across his neck, enforcer on his face, and a swastika on his chin. A brutal brawl with Rebels boss Nick Martin in 2020 cemented his reputation, 2 weeks before Martin was assassinated. Expelled, hunted, and marked for death, Brajkovich became Australia's most infamous outlaw. Stick around, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The making of a monster. Dayne Brajkovich was born on November 11, 1979 in Belmont, a tough working-class suburb of Perth. It's a place he still wears on his skin, with 6104, Belmont's postcode, tattooed on his left ear. His childhood didn't hint at the path he'd later take. Raised by a single mother who pushed him to be responsible, she even made him buy a house with her when he was just 18, nothing about his early life suggested he would one day become one of Australia's most notorious bikies. But violence had a way of finding him. As a young man, he stepped into the boxing ring. His time in the sport was short but unforgettable, ending in a brutal second-round knockout loss to Nick Cara. What should have been a shot at sporting success became something else entirely, the first doorway into a much darker life. The shift from fighter to outlaw didn't happen overnight. In 2009, Brajkovich was hit with an ecstasy dealing charge that earned him 2 years behind bars. Prison didn't break him, it hardened him. By the time he got out, he wasn't the same man. He was bigger, bulked up from steroids, and driven by something new, a hunger for power, fear, and the kind of respect that only comes from being part of an outlaw brotherhood. The tattooed canvas of violence. To really understand Dayne Brajkovich, you have to look at his tattoos. They're not random designs, they're a timeline carved into his skin, each mark tracing his journey deeper into the outlaw world, further away from the clean-cut teenager he once was. It began with simple floral patterns on his shoulders and arms, but over time, the ink spread, taking over his body like an unstoppable force. Dragons clashed across his chest, Chinese symbols appeared on his torso, and when the tattoos began climbing onto his face, that's when people really started paying attention. By the time he was patched into the Hells Angels, Brajkovich had turned himself into something else entirely. A man who wore his reputation on his skin, revenge across his neck, enforcer on the top of his head, and word enforcer left no doubt about his role, and on his forehead, the image of Jesus crowned with thorns, a dark and twisted irony for someone who had chosen a life built on violence. But the most shocking of all was the Nazi swastika on his chin, boxed in by the letters X and S. When asked about it, Brajkovich didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to welcome the outrage it caused. These tattoos weren't just body art, they were weapons designed to strike fear before he ever raised a fist. Yet, even among the symbols of aggression, softer markings stood out. Twice, the name Jacinta was inked into his skin, along with the name of his stepdaughter. For all the violence he carried on the outside, these tattoos revealed something else, that even in his darkest transformation, love still found its way onto his body. Rise to power. The Hells Angels years. For Dayne Brajkovich, joining the Hells Angels was never just about wearing a patch. It was about stepping fully into the role he was built for, an enforcer. As Sergeant-at-Arms, he became the club's muscle, the man who handled business when someone needed to be reminded of where they stood. "I was bashing all the prospects," he would later boast, describing his work with the kind of casual brutality that summed up his time in the Angels. For 4 years, this was his life. He lived and breathed the outlaw code, and by the time it was over, he'd gathered so much Hells Angels gear that when he was finally expelled, it filled 8 large garbage bags. But his reputation as one of Australia's most feared bikies wasn't built in private. It was made in public. The defining moment came in November 2020 at Scarborough's Sandbar. The confrontation with Rebels boss Nick Martin, caught on CCTV,
became one of the most infamous pieces of bikie footage ever seen in Australia. The video is brutally simple. Two men meet, shake hands, exchange a few words, and then Brajkovich explodes. A flurry of punches sends Martin crashing over tables and chairs. Panicked patrons scramble as the former Muay Thai fighter makes his point loud and clear. Martin, dazed, shirtless, and clutching his thongs, follows Brajkovich out. A moment that perfectly shows both the menace and the absurdity of bikie culture. And then came the part that made it all even darker. Just 2 weeks later, Nick Martin would be gunned down by a sniper at Perth Motorplex while watching the drag races with his family. No one can say for sure if the two incidents were directly linked, but the timing spoke volumes. In Brajkovich's world, violence didn't just settle scores, it set the stage for the next one. Today's rival could easily become tomorrow's corpse.
The Gold Rush Scandal. Even as Dayne Brajkovich fought to stay alive, his name kept surfacing in the headlines. In June 2022, it was revealed that he'd purchased $27,000 worth of gold from the Perth Mint, another chapter in his tangled web of crime and controversy. What made this story explosive wasn't just the money, though $27,000 is no small sum, but the way the transaction happened. The Perth Mint, a government-owned institution bound by strict laws to vet high-risk customers, had apparently done little more than glance at his driver's license. No deep checks, no questions about where the money came from. The result was staggering. Here was a man with a long criminal record, tattooed head to toe in gang insignia, recently expelled from the Hells Angels, and yet he could stroll into a state-run facility and walk out with thousands in gold. The scandal grew so big it reached the Senate, triggering inquiries, investigations, and reforms that cost taxpayers millions. For Brajkovich, though, it barely registered. In his world, taking advantage of weak spots in the system wasn't shocking or scandalous. To him, it was just business, just another Tuesday. The price of infamy. Living as Australia's most recognizable outlaw came with problems most criminals never had to worry about. Dayne Brajkovich's tattoos made him stand out instantly, not just to police and rival gangs, but to the public as well. And when Western Australia rolled out strict new anti-insignia laws aimed squarely at bikie culture, he became the perfect test case. The legal fight that followed his expulsion from the Hells Angels exposed just how far Brajkovich was willing to go to dodge prosecution. His wife, Jacinta, would take a black pen and layers of foundation to cover his tattoos every time he stepped out of the house. The idea of one of Australia's most feared bikies sitting patiently while his wife painted over his face with makeup was almost absurd, but it also showed the depth of their bond. By the time he finally stood in court, Brajkovich had made bold changes to his appearance. The large Hells Angels insignia that once marked him had been hidden under thick stripes of black. The 1% ink across his chest was turned into a black diamond. And, most controversially of all, he replaced some of his club markings with 3 words written across his forehead: "Fuck the police." These weren't just tattoos anymore, they were a message, a declaration of defiance aimed at both his former club and the system trying to rein him in. In true Brajkovich fashion, he had turned his own face into a billboard of rebellion. The new Dayne Brajkovich. The Dayne Brajkovich who walked away from the Kings Park attack wasn't the same man people had known before. Reformed might be pushing it. After all, his face still screams his hatred for police. But there's no denying that brush with death left him changed. In truth, the shift had already started. Life with Jacinta and her daughter was slowly pulling him in a different direction, even before the attack. "Me and Jacinta don't drink, smoke, or take drugs. I think that's what makes us tick," he admitted in a rare reflective moment. The wild club parties and late-night runs with criminals were gone. Instead, it was Thai massages, movie nights, and family dinners. That change carried into his role at home. Jacinta's daughter, now 11, has become the child he could never have. His health made that impossible. So this man covered in gang tattoos, once a feared Hells Angels enforcer, is now helping a little girl with homework or taking her to see a film. It's an image that almost feels out of place against his reputation, but it's real. And perhaps the clearest sign of his transformation comes straight from him. Quote, "I work 5 days a week and train 6. In my spare time, I buy gold and hang out with my girls." For someone who once thrived on violence and chaos, finding peace in routine and family is about as radical a change as you could imagine. The paradox of Dayne Brajkovich. What makes Dayne Brajkovich's story so gripping isn't just the violence, the betrayals, or the headlines. It's the contradictions that run right through him. Here's a man who talks about loyalty, yet turned on his own club. Someone who plays the role of a family man, yet wears a face that screams hatred. A career criminal who mocks the justice system while still being trapped under its weight. His tattoos tell this story louder than words ever could. You'll see religious images inked beside gang emblems, declarations of love etched next to promises of revenge, a Nazi swastika sitting just inches away from his wife's name. His face isn't just covered in ink, it's a war zone, a clash between the man he used to be and the man he's trying to become. And maybe that's why he fascinates people. In many ways, he proves that change is possible even in the darkest corners of the underworld. His bond with Jacinta and her daughter shows there's room for love, loyalty, and sacrifice, even for someone with his past. But at the same time, his life shows how hard it is to ever truly walk away from violence. No matter how much he wants to just be a husband and stepdad, those tattoos brand him forever. He'll always be Dayne Brajkovich, the man whose very face makes sure Australia never forgets his past as a Hell's Angel.
The unfinished story. As of now, Dayne Brajkovich is still alive. But in the world he comes from, survival is never guaranteed. The outlaw life moves fast, and debts always get collected, sometimes when you least expect it. What we do know is that his story isn't finished. At just 44, there are still chapters left to be written, whether they lead to more violence, some kind of redemption, or both. His marriage to Jacinta has undeniably reshaped him, but the real test is whether love can truly stand against the brutal logic of bikie culture. The attack at Kings Park was supposed to close the book on him. Instead, it became a strange new beginning. Surviving what should have been a death sentence only fed into his legend. And in the twisted value system of the underworld, making it through an assassination attempt earns a man its own dark kind of respect. But the bigger question isn't if Brajkovich can dodge the next attempt, it's whether he can keep changing. This is a man who once bragged about bashing all the prospects, now walking hand in hand to the movies with his stepdaughter. Yet even in family life, he still carries himself like someone who expects war around every corner. In the end, his story is uniquely Australian, a mix of violence, loyalty, love, and the high cost of living outside the law. It's still unfolding in the streets of Perth, in the headlines splashed across newspapers, and in the quiet life he's trying to build with the family that chose to stand by him. Whether it ends in redemption or tragedy is impossible to say. But one thing is certain, as long as Dayne Brajkovich is alive, Australia's criminal underworld won't ever be quite the same. His journey from teenage recruit to feared Hells Angels enforcer to marked man and finally to reluctant stepdad proves that even in the darkest corners, change is possible, even if it comes slow and costs dearly. The real question isn't whether he deserves a second chance. In his world, second chances are rarer than survival itself. The question is whether love can outweigh violence, and whether a man defined by the ink on his face can write a different ending with the choices he makes each day. For now, Dayne Brajkovich remains Australia's most recognizable outlaw, a walking contradiction, a man who embodies both the worst of bikie culture and the small but stubborn hope that people can change, even when their past screams otherwise.